The problem of animals suffering and pain poses a difficult problem of evil. Unlike humans, animals are often seen as morally innocent, yet they experience pain, predation, and natural disasters. For many, this seems inconsistent with the existence of a loving and just God. But philosopher Peter van Inwagen, in his book The Problem of Evil, offers a defense that attempts to reconcile animal suffering with God's goodness, known as the anti-irregularity defense. Welcome to Christian Philosophy Academy. I'm Dr. Christopher Kloos. I created this channel to help you think deeply about your faith so that you can effectively defend it and stand firm in it. Let's jump into the slides and take a look at Peter van Inwagen's case. Peter van Inwagen starts by talking about the difference between a theodicy and a defense. A theodicy is where you're going to give a reason to show that it's actually plausible to suppose that something is true. So, like for instance, the soul-building theodicy gives the reason that God allows people to suffer in order to refine their character and achieve virtues. And so that is actually supposed to be put forward as an actual reason God has for allowing certain kinds of suffering. Now, that contrasts with a defense. A defense is more modest. It says, according to Peter van Inwagen, it just shows that for all anyone knows, P is true. So you're not actually saying this is the reason that God had in mind to allow suffering. You're just saying, for all we know, this could be a reason and could be true. Now, Peter van Inwagen is going to actually generate a compound defense. This is a really important, fascinating strategy in responding to a problem of evil. So basically, he blends together a bunch of different types of sort of propositions or stances, and they together make a stronger case. Called a compound defense. And we're going to break down each proposition that he offers to explain animal suffering, and then how it works, and then eventually a couple challenges to his view. So here's the big idea to kind of get your head around, and I call him PVI for short, Peter van Inwagen. So if you see PVI in the slides, that's what it means. And he offers a defense of the suffering of wild animals, which he calls beasts. You don't hear that term very often. You know, you've got the Rolling Stones, beast of burden. But what he means by beasts is just animals in the wild, and where that suffering basically isn't the direct result of human freedom or free choice. So there are four key terms we have to keep in mind as we work through his defense. First is just higher level sentient creatures. This is basically creatures like us and other higher order mammals. So that's basically animals that are conscious. Additionally, morally equivalent patterns of suffering. So two patterns are morally equivalent in terms of their suffering if there's no decisive reason that would favor one pattern of suffering over the other. And it's not to say, this is not to say that they're in any interesting sense comparable. So he gives the example of comparing pain due to cancer to, I believe it's like a tornado, or natural disasters. You know, even though these are morally equivalent, cancer causes a ton of pain and suffering and death. Natural disasters cause a ton of pain and suffering and death. Is the pain caused by cancer worse than the pain caused by natural disasters? Well, you might not be able to compare them, but that they can still be morally equivalent in terms of there's no decisive reason to favor one pattern or create a world that has one pattern over another. And his big term is massive irregularity. What does that mean? Well, the laws of nature fail in some massive way. And so a world or a physical universe containing all the miracles recorded in the Old and New Testaments would not, on that account, be massively irregular, for those miracles were too small and too few and far between. So you have just thinking about miracles in terms of breaking the laws of nature. You have miracles occurring, but it's not like there's all the laws of nature failing in some massive way, like gravity is failing or some other law is failing. So even though there are a lot of miracles recorded in Scripture, that doesn't create a world that's massively irregular. Now, what is a defect in the world? Well, it's a feature of a world that a world would be intrinsically better for not having, whatever extrinsic value might have. So we're going to get to what the defect is that we're considering. Now, Peter van Inwagen is launching a good harm analysis. So in Bethany Solderer's book, God, Evolution, and Animal Suffering, she cites Christopher Southgate, who uses this terminology, and I thought she just put it really well and concisely, so I'm using her formulation of it to kind of show you that this is what Peter van Inwagen is up to. What is a GHA, a good harm analysis? Well, that is, they are ways of absolving God of culpability for animal suffering by proposing a good that outweighs the harm of the suffering. And so, as a result, God hasn't baked unnecessary evil into natural processes. Now, here's the fourfold defense. First, one, every world God could have made that contains higher level sentient creatures either contains patterns of suffering morally equivalent to those of the actual world, or is massively irregular. So let's break that down. Every world God could have created, so we imagine God is standing, trying to figure out what sort of world he could create that would lead to humans, conscious, higher level animals, and they would have patterns of suffering, and that would be morally equivalent to the actual world, the suffering we see here of animals, right? Or if it didn't have that suffering, it would be massively irregular. Why? Because God would need to constantly intervene to prevent the suffering. It may not be enough to just put an antiseptic in the fangs of the cougar so that when it bites down on the animal, it sort of releases something that eases the pain. God would need to make it so there's no predation. He would need to constantly intervene in order to have laws like our world, in order to lead to the progression toward us, higher level creatures. So if God wasn't to allow that sort of suffering to occur that we actually have, he could have created another pattern of suffering. But the idea here is whatever other pattern of suffering he would have created, there'd be no morally decisive reason that favors that pattern of suffering over the pattern of suffering we see in the actual world. And so those are morally equivalent, right? Or he creates a massively irregular world where he can make it where there's no pain and suffering, but then he's got to constantly be breaking the laws of nature, not just sporadically like we see in the New Testament. Occasionally miracles are done and so on, but like constant intervention into the natural world to prevent any animal suffering. And so the world would be massively irregular. Now, this is what's called a property consequence GHA, good harm analysis. So it's a quote, a consequence of the existence of a good as a property of a particular system is the possibility that possession of this good leads to causing harms. What's the good here? Let's go back. The good would be that the world contains higher level sentient creatures. Why is that a good? Well, God wants to love creatures. God wants to give us the chance to exist, the chance to love each other, and to have a relationship with him, our highest good. So it would be good for there to be a world where there's higher level sentient creatures that could love God in return and be co-authors with him in existence and providence and taking care of creation. So that would be a good, but in order to get that, every world he could create that would contain morally equivalent patterns of suffering, it would be a consequence of that property of a particular being or system that had that good, the world had that good of producing higher level sentient creatures. It would be a consequence of that, that there would be the possibility of possession of this good leading to causing harms, right? So to get to higher level sentient creatures, if he's not going to just intervene constantly, or here's the thing, he could have just, bam, created us, right? And created the whole world 5 minutes ago and made it look like everything's old and so on, and just plopped us all here and not allowed for an evolutionary process or a slow development of species up to the point of us. But that would have been massively irregular, right? I mean, not only would it be just, he would have had to finagle and not allow laws to function as they do to create the world, but he would also be a deceptive God. That's the other thing that Peter van Inwagen talks about. So it would be massively irregular if it was created 5 minutes ago as well. So here's an example, and another example is the free will defense. And Peter van Inwagen, in the first part of the book, he gives a free will defense that covers moral evil. Now he's dealing with natural evil as applied to animals, but he gives a free will defense, and that is like the good of freedom can allow for great suffering. People can misuse that freedom. So that's another example of a property consequence, GHA. Now, the second proposition, some important intrinsic or extrinsic good depends on the existence of higher level sentient creatures. This good is of sufficient magnitude that it outweighs the pattern of suffering found in the actual world. So in one, we just had that there is this good, that he can create a world that leads to higher level sentient creatures, but we have the consequence of that. If we allows for that without creating a massively irregular world, it's going to lead to some pain and suffering, including suffering of animals and nature. But there are important intrinsic and extrinsic goods that depend on the existence of those higher level sentient creature, and that good is sufficient to outweigh the bad of the patterns of suffering we see in the actual world. So that good of a world containing higher level sentient creatures and the intrinsic and extrinsic goods that come out of that outweigh the pattern of suffering we see in the actual world, natural world. Now, this is a developmental or instrumental GHA. How is it developmental? Well, it's, as she says, quote, the good is a goal which can only be developed through a process which includes the possibility or necessity of harm. So again, you think about just natural selection and allowing for the progression of species, not just instantly creating humans. So God put us in a world, maybe he created the first humans, or he did Peter van Inwagen thinks that the primordial sort of pre-human species, he must have done some sort of miraculous thing to instill consciousness in those beings so that, we could progress and become fully conscious humans, Homo sapiens. So the good is a goal which can only be developed through a process which includes the possibility or necessity of harm. So going back, these goods include the possibility of harm. So the good of us developing into higher level sentient creatures, the progression into higher level sentient creatures, is used to, many of those good goals are developed by use of the harms in questions. So the predation, the competition, the evolution of species, which entails a whole lot of pain and suffering, that is used in order to secure the good of having higher level sentient creatures and having the intrinsic and extrinsic goods that come out of having a world containing those creatures. Now, we can apply this to Proposition 2. Quote, some good comes through the higher level sentient creatures, and these creatures could only have developed through a process that involves suffering. So that kind of summarizes what I was just saying. Now, what about a byproduct, GHA? Well, quote, therefore, the whole ladder, so this is another aspect of Proposition 2, there's a byproduct good-harm analysis as well, not just an instrumental developmental one. Therefore, the whole ladder of intermediate forms is a necessary good to the full expression of God's creativity, and that can be like a constitutive or developmental byproduct, GHA, depending on how it's elaborated. So the evolution of species that were a ladder, intermediate forms that led to the full expression of God's creativity in creating higher level sentient creatures, that those individual intermediate steps are a byproduct of him reaching for that full goal, which is the end products or the end goal, so to speak, of higher level sentient creatures. And it's a byproduct that there are these intermediate forms that are necessary to achieve that thing and are going to suffer as well in the process. Now, a constitutive GHA is, quote, existence of a good is inherently, constitutively inseparable from the experiment of harm or suffering. So, experience, that's a typo. Experiment of harm and suffering. Let's not experiment, although we have experimented a lot on animals. So that's a whole separate issue because that's using free will. We're talking about just animals in nature. So it's that ladder, that stepwise development of intermediate forms of species in order to lead to higher level sentient species is basically constitutive of, or a major a part of, inseparable from the experience of harm and suffering. So the process that leads to us as a byproduct contains a ton of pain and suffering. Now let's go on to Proposition 3, but before we do, it's time for a little coffee break with clues. I definitely recommend getting a coffee. Hey, Peter van Inwagen's a little heady. I know, it gets a little crazy, but I recommend a little coffee break, let a little brain break, and then let's jump back in and keep it rocking, keep it rolling. Okay, so Proposition 3, being massively irregular is a defect in a world. A defect is least as great as the defect of containing patterns of suffering, morally equivalent to those found in the actual world. So, the being massively irregular, if the world were massively irregular, it couldn't naturally lead to us, and it would be a major defect in the world. God couldn't hand over the world to us, that's for sure, and at least as great as the suffering that we actually see in the actual world. And this is a property consequence, GHA. So extrinsically, 3 is an anthropocentric property consequence, GHA. So it's centered on humans. It's what I mentioned earlier, that like a massive irregularity would be a defect because God couldn't hand over the world. Remember, we were talking about God wants to hand over the world to us, so we can care for it and have responsibility for creation and be in relation to him as well and responsible to him. And he can't do that if the world is massively irregular. So extrinsically, 3 is a anthropocentric property consequence, GHA, in terms of the good of handing over rule to humans. So, quote, PVI argues the world is meant to be handed over to human rule in the eschaton, and that's end times, and it would be hard to see how work of massive irregularity could be handed over if it continually depended on direct divine intervention. So if he couldn't hand over the world, he's got to keep taking it back, right? Massive irregularity, a world that's massively irregular, couldn't be handed over to us for us to then do our work, because he'd have to keep intervening and overriding everything we're trying to do and circumvent it in order to make it function, really. Now, a world of this is like thus a world of gnomic regularity is good for the sake of humans who will one day rule it, right? So gnomic regularity is like regularity of the universe according to the laws of nature. So if I drop my glasses, they fall, gravity works. It's a good thing. We can expect, we're not going to just fly up off the ceiling, or levitate into the air randomly, or objects are going to just instead of dropping, they're just going to go up and so on. So it allows, that law of gravity allows for all sorts of regularity that we depend on for our very existence. And so that's good for us in terms of being able to rule the world. Now, the world, number 4, the world, the cosmos, and the physical universe has been created by God. So that we won't go into much. That's just, it's a proposition that he asserts. Everything's been created by God. Now, what about a massively irregular world? Let's get a little more specific. What would that look like? Well, let's take a look at an example. He gives the example as follows, quote, God, by means of an ages-long series of ubiquitous miracles, causes a planet inhabited by the same animal life as the actual Earth to be a hedonic utopia. Hedonic pleasure. So it's like a pleasurable utopia. On this planet, fawns are like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, saved by angels when they are in danger of being burnt alive. Think of Rose fawn in the forest would be saved. Harmful parasites and microorganisms suffer immediate supernatural dissolution if they enter a higher animal's body. Lambs are miraculously hidden from lions, and lions are compensated for the resulting restriction on their diets by physically impossible falls of high-protein manna. On this planet, either God created every species by a separate miracle, or else, although all living things evolved from a common ancestor, a hedonic utopia has existed at every stage of the evolutionary process. So, this is what I was explaining earlier, what it would take to create a massively irregular world. God would have to miraculously create all the species and then miraculously constantly intervene in order to sustain a world that is where animals do not suffer at all, right? Now, let's take a look at this key point. There's a key point you got to keep in mind. So if you miss this, you'll keep wondering, as I did when I first read Peter van Inwagen's take on animal suffering. I kept wondering, why is he talking about a hedonic utopia? Like, why not something short of a utopia? Do all animals not have to suffer at all? Why not just like a highly pleasurable world that's kind of, some animals suffer a bit, but they aren't just in a hedonic total pleasure utopia. Well, for massive irregularity, you need lots of violations or failures of the laws of nature, and creating and sustaining a hedonic utopia requires such interventions. You got to kind of keep that in mind. We're trying to see what it would be like for God to create a massively irregular world, right? And it would just for him to have this utopia, it would be massively irregular, right? For there to be no animal pain and suffering. And why not talk of something short of a utopia? Well, then we might not be talking about a massively irregular world. If it's just short, it's still going to require a massive amount of interventions, right? Even if he lets some animals slide and suffer, he's going to constantly have to be intervening as well. So if it's just shy of utopia, It's going to be massive irregularity, and then there's going to be a sliding scale, right? And very quickly, if God's not going to be constantly intervening, you just run into a morally equivalent pattern of suffering that's equivalent to the pattern of suffering we see in the actual world, where you have this progression toward higher level sentient creatures. Now, he gives a second case. So let's take a look at his second case. Quote, it would also be possible for a world to be massively irregular in more systematic or wholesale way. A world that came into existence 5 minutes ago, replete with memories of an unreal past, would be on that account alone massively irregular. If indeed such a world was metaphysically possible, a world in which beasts having the physical structures and exhibiting the pain behavior of actual beasts, felt no pain, would be on that account alone massively irregular. Indeed, if such a world were metaphysically possible. So a world that was created in the past with all these memories would have had to, the laws of nature would have had to fail in massive ways. God would have just had to do massive miracles in terms of giving everybody, fake sets of memories of an unreal past. Or if animals aren't going to suffer at all, God would also have to do a crazy miracle, either to imbue them with systems that didn't come about through natural selection, but were completely different, where things were completely arranged differently so they didn't experience pain. And then he would have to intervene in that as well to make sure that it keeps working that way. So this leads to the big question. Here's the big question. Could God have created a hedonic utopia, so with all the benefits of no animal suffering, that also contained higher level sentient creatures without that world being massively irregular, right? So could God have created a world that had us in it with no animal suffering and yet also wasn't massively irregular, such that the thing was crazy and the laws of nature were always being overridden or failing constantly? Well, he says, let's look at how we could design a world. First, you got to cash out the laws of nature. Second, you got to explain the boundary conditions, how things fall within certain ranges and work. You got to tell the story of cosmic evolution. How did the cosmos evolve? And then you got to tell the story of the evolution of life, right? So these are the 4 steps for designing a world. So he wonders, well, could God, let's just for instance say the laws of nature are deterministic. And he freely admits, yes, God could fine-tune the laws of nature from the start. If they were deterministic, if it was guaranteed to produce a hedonic utopia, right? And if he could, set the laws of nature such that they're deterministic, that they for sure guarantee a hedonic utopia, then yeah, he could fine-tune the universe so that it naturally progressed to that and was sort of guaranteed to lead to that state. But as he points out, the laws of nature, especially at the subatomic level, in terms of quantum mechanics, the world, if the laws of nature are indeterministic, which they seem to be at its lowest level, then no, God couldn't just fine-tune the original laws of nature to achieve a hedonic utopia, and yet it will definitely work out to where the world is a hedonic utopia, and he hasn't had to massively intervene. So if it's deterministic, if there's probabilistic chance involved in the way that the cosmos evolves and the way that human life evolves, he's going to have to constantly tinker to make sure it goes this way instead of this way, right? Instead of just by chance going one way or the other, because the laws of nature would be indeterministic. There'd be randomness and chance involved in the laws. So he says, that's not going to work given at least what we know about the quantum level now. So what would be the laws governing the evolution of the cosmos and of intelligent life? Well, he says only in a universe like ours could intelligent life, or indeed life of any sort, develop by the operation of laws of nature, unsupplemented by miracles. And the natural evolution of higher sentient life in a universe like ours essentially involves suffering. So, evolution of species, just suffering is baked into it. And only with laws of nature, like we find in the actual world, would there be intelligent life or any life at all. And because we know the laws are fine tuned to produce intelligent life, to allow for the possibility of intelligent life. And so it'd be a world like ours that could achieve intelligent life, but it's going to involve pain and suffering if it's not going to be massively irregular. And as he says, pain is a crucial component of the evolution of ancestors to humans, and, quote, the amount of pain that organisms have experienced in the actual world, or some amount morally equivalent to that amount, is necessary for the natural evolution of conscious animals, end quote. Now, you might be, I'm in the back of my mind, I'm saying, well, what if you are a creationist? You believe there is no evolution, or God, I mean, if it's equivalent, it's compatible with God guiding evolution, and that's what this account would be, or God allowing for evolution and creating it, that you might be wondering, well, do I have to believe in evolution to accept Peter van Inwagen's anti-irregularity defense? Good question. So, what it's important to keep in mind is Peter van Inwagen is addressing a agnostic. That's the picture of who he has in mind. So you're trying to convince an agnostic that the pain and suffering that we see in the world of animals in the wild isn't evidence against the existence of God, or doesn't make it likely God doesn't exist, right? So that person would be a naturalist, or they don't believe in God. They would embrace the sciences and embrace evolution, which is a well-attested scientific theory. And so even if you, in your own sort of walk, are a creationist and you don't believe in evolution, if you're sitting in the courtroom and trying to defend God from someone who buys into evolution, then you need to meet them on their terms. And so even if you yourself don't believe in evolution, macroevolution of species to us, then you still would want to, in that situation, endorse the assumption of evolution and show that there's a way of making sense of the animal suffering on your account that doesn't impinge on God. So I just thought I'd mention that in case you're like, do I need to accept evolution? I mean, I do, but I know a lot of Christians don't. So I just thought I'd mention that. That's an important point to keep in mind. Now, what about Proposition 2? How does he defend this? Some important intrinsic and extrinsic good depends on the existence of us, and it outweighs the pattern of suffering of animals that we see in the actual world. Well, the intrinsic good might be that the earth, right before humans, contained more intrinsic good than a world with no creatures higher than cockroaches. So would it be good in and of itself to have a world that can had the precursors to humans or to intelligent life in it, as opposed to just a world with creatures that don't have the sort of intelligence that is a precursor to higher level intelligence? And he thinks, actually, it would be good. The earth, right before humans even came into existence, it would be good that there were higher level sentient creatures. Now, you could push back on that and say, well, if they're not fully conscious or they don't have full rationality of a human level, then these intermediate forms really are more like animal-like. But that's a hard pill to swallow, because you see in the Neanderthal and species leading up to humans that there's great tool use, there's ingenuity. So it's not clear that they're complete animals, just ruled by instinct. And if they really do have higher level or some sentience and rationality, then it's the case that that would still be a good for those type of creatures to exist, as opposed to animals with no intelligence. Now, what about the extrinsic good? Well, quote, intelligent life, creatures made in the image and likeness of God, could not evolve directly from worms or oysters. So, the intermediate evolutionary precursors of intelligent animals must possess higher level sentience. So actually, for Peter van Inwagen, our precursors, I was being a little bit more modest, but he thinks our direct ancestral precursors would actually have to have higher level sentience. And he actually says it would be miraculous that they developed that, but that's kind of a whole separate thing, because when you look at evolution, he's like, you couldn't have got to consciousness and higher level intelligence in the amount of time that we're supposed to have evolved. So he thinks at some point God had to intervene and give us that capacity. Now, what about Proposition 3? Okay, being massively irregular is a defect in a world, a defect at least as great as the defect of containing patterns of suffering morally equivalent to those found in the actual world. So it's a mouthful, but how does he defend this massive irregularity being a defect? Well, here's the key question. Is there a prima facie case that the actual suffering of non-human wild animals is a worse defect than massive irregularity? Remember, massive irregularity, you're going to have constant interventions into the world that we find ourselves in, and we won't be able to, do any ruling. We'll just be passive. So is there a case, though? The key question before us is there a case that the actual suffering of non-human animals is worse defect than massive irregularity? A world in which either God just creates it all in an instant, or God's constantly intervening, or there's no higher level sentient creatures, right? Because the idea is God couldn't have created higher level sentient creatures without the pain and suffering we see progressing through intermediate species leading to us. So he says, well, there are some suggestive points, right? There's deists who think any amount of irregularity is a defect, and massive irregularity is a defect. So he says, these people don't even believe God is active in creation, and they think if God created a massively irregular world, or just a world with some irregularity, that would be a defect. So he says, well, that might be some evidence for theists also. And massively irregular worlds are also massively deceptive, and such deception is inconsistent with a perfect God. So going back to the case of creating the world 5 minutes ago with an unreal past, and all of us having been given memories of a fake past and everything looking old, but it really isn't old. It was created 5 minutes ago. He says, whoa, that would be really deceptive, and God is not a deceiver. God is all good. And so that would be inconsistent with God's perfect goodness or God's perfect nature. Let's look here at philosopher Frank. And this is actually my brother-in-law. Who's named Frank? Love you, bro. So I had to get a shout out to my bro-in-law. Here's Frank, and he's going to make his case. So he's saying, well, let's imagine Frank, the philosopher, is sitting back and trying to figure out whether the actual suffering that we see of beasts in the natural world is worse defect than a world with massive irregularity. So he says, imagine Frank has a considered judgment that the actual suffering of beasts is worse than massive irregularity. Okay, now he says Frank is amazing. Had to give him a little cape there. So, quote, Frank possesses a faculty to do this. Peter van Inwagen thinks Frank would have to possess a faculty that enables him to correctly judge the relative value of states of affairs of literally cosmic magnitude that are in no way connected with the practical concerns of human beings. So Frank would have to sit back and imagine a world that was massively irregular, had constant interventions, and yet was not a worse defect than all the suffering we see from animals in the actual world. So Frank has to imagine these two worlds, and not just imagine them, but imagine them in a lot of detail in order to correctly judge and to have a real considered judgment that one is worse than the other. So, and Peter van Inwagen thinks that's just crazy. Like Frank's awesome and all, but he's highly skeptical he can do that. And this is Peter van Inwagen's famous or infamous, depending on what you think, modal skepticism. So he thinks our modal intuitions about possibilities are reliable concerning everyday possibilities. It's possible if I go to the store that I end up buying some candy. Maybe I shouldn't go to the store, or maybe I should. But he says they aren't reliable, these modal intuitions about possibility and necessity, when imagining whether a whole world is possible. A world which is not massively irregular. Remember, that's what you got to imagine. He's got to imagine a world that's not massively irregular, yet contains higher level sentient creatures that do not suffer, right? So he thinks, wow, our modal intuitions are going to not be reliable about that. So kind of the upshot is, given PVI's modal skepticism, quote, there is no prima facie case for the thesis that the actual suffering of beasts constitute a graver defect in a world than does massive irregularity. Or at least there's no case grounded in our intuitions about value, and in what else could such a case be grounded? Right? So he thinks there is no prima facie case that it's a worse defect for the world to contain, for the actual suffering of beasts to constitute a graver defect in a world than does massive irregularity. Wow. Now, there are objections to PVI's modal skepticism. So here's one way of pushing back. And this is from the book Knowledge, Belief in God by Matthew Benton, John Hawthorne, and Danny Rabinowitz. And it's the actual article and paper is called Moderate Modal Skepticism by Margaret Stromhinger and Johann Yule Bakuri. Sorry if I got that a little off, but they wrote a paper about Peter van Inwagen's modal skepticism, and they applied pressure to his views. So this would be one way of sort of resisting his case, to say, no, you can make a prima facie case. Our modal intuitions can track these possibilities in considering whole worlds. So you can resist his view by this. And so here's underlying PVI's modal skepticism are the following commitments. Worlds. It is possible that P, if and only if, there is a possible world in which it is the case that P. So possibility requires that the fact is instantiated in a possible world. Okay, that's pretty strong. Quote, to assert that P, this is from PVI's 1998 paper as well that they quote, to assert that P is possible, after all, is to commit oneself willy-nilly to the thesis that there's a whole coherent reality. And that's what you're imagining when you're imagining possible worlds. It's got to be a whole world, coherent reality, a possible world in which P is true, of which the truth of P is an integral part. So again, it has to be a possible world where P is instantiated and is actually part of that world. Now, so PVI embraces Yablo's, specificity requirement. So, namely, in imagining a world in which it is the case that P, it requires imagining P is true in a very specific way. So you have to really imagine P is the case in a possible world, you have to imagine the world in sufficient detail, and you have to imagine that, P being the case in a way that is integral to that world. So he gives the example of a perfect being. You can't just imagine a world with a perfect being. You have to fill in the possibilities. Was that perfect being incarnate, not incarnate, identical with Jesus or not? To really imagine a possible world with a perfect being, we've got to fill in more of the details in the relevant sense. Now, so there's one further part. So we've got worlds, right? We've got specificity requirement from Yablo. And then this is Peter van Inwagen's, where the skepticism comes in. He says, look, we've got imaginative limitations. We can't do this. Quote, he says, in my view, anyone who attempts to imagine a world with a transparent iron, imagine that. Try to think of a world with a transparent iron. Will either fail to imagine a world or else will imagine a world that only seems to have the property of being a world in which the thing in question exists. Can we imagine a world in which there's a transparent iron? Well, not unless our imaginings take place at a level of structural detail comparable to that of the imaginings of condensed matter. Physicists who are trying to explain, say, the phenomenon of superconductivity. So to imagine how there could be an iron, I don't even know how to explain it, like an object that has metallic properties and can be used to iron out wrinkles and yet is transparent. So you've got to go down to the molecular level and kind of figure out how you could achieve transparency of such an object, right? So he's thinking, just to do a transparent iron in a possible world would be impossible, he thinks. So you're going to just fail to imagine a world, or you're going to seem to imagine a world that has that property. But remember, going back to worlds, it won't actually be the case that in that possible world there is a transparent iron. And you can also undermine this epistemology underlying his modal skepticism by, you can also deny worlds. So you can argue that it's not obvious there are possible worlds. So think of David Lewis. He argues, he's got his modal realism. Possible worlds are real. That philosophers have not always gotten on board with that. There's a lot of different range of responses, but you could argue, hey, it's not obvious that there actually are possible worlds. So you could deny world. You could deny specificity. Hey, we don't need to imagine a world in sufficient detail to assess whether P holds in that world, right? You could deny the unreliability of imagination. So you could do one or the other or a combination of these three ingredients into his modal skepticism in order to resist it and say, no, our modal intuitions can be reliable when imagining possible worlds and whether things obtain in them. Now, in response to this, PVI invokes Job. Job lost everything. The devil tormented him, but yet he didn't curse God. And in the end, Job was put in his place. So he says, if you think you know that nothing important hinges on the world's regularity, we can ask why you're in a position to know this. Recall the sharp rhetorical questions God asked Job, such as, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Or, can you tie up the chains of Pleiades or untie the cords of Orion? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens, or do you establish their rule over the earth? Right? So he's saying we need to have some epistemic humility in these issues and not think that we can imagine such a world and that a world could be regular and lead to higher level sentient creatures and not have the pain and suffering that we see in the actual world. So the upshot of sort of the defense of Proposition 3 is that for all we know, either the disutility, intrinsic or extrinsic, of massive irregularity in a world is greater than the intrinsic disutility that is a consequence of containing vast amounts of suffering, animal suffering, or else the disutility of massive irregularity and the disutility of containing vast amount of animal suffering are incomparable, right? So they just simply can't be compared. Or it's the case that the disutility of a massively irregular world is greater than the disutility that's the consequence of the world that we see that has certain amounts of animal suffering, but also leads to higher level sentient creatures. Now, that was a global global defense, and it's a response to the argument that involves the premise that animal suffering in fact exists. So he's responding to the claim that the bigger picture that animal suffering exists, but there's a local defense. So PVI shifts from a global defense to a local defense, and that's a response to William Rowe's fawn, Suffering in the Forest, like that a particular instance of suffering is pointless, and therefore it's evidence that God doesn't exist. So here's the key point to remember: two patterns of suffering may be morally equivalent even if they're comparable, and one of them involves less suffering than the other. So remember, I was talking about that scale, right? You could have a world that is a hedonic utopia, and you step down from that a little bit, you're still going to have massive irregularity, right? And so it'll be a defect in the world to have massive irregularity, at least on par with the world that has the actual suffering we see. And then when you step away, there's no magic line, right? There's no magic point at which it would step away. But, once massive irregularity fades, he says you're going to eventually end up in a pattern of suffering that, if God's not constantly intervening to keep up a hedonic utopia, or even a little bit lesser of a utopia or less hedons, then you're going to have a world that still has pain and suffering in it. And it's going to be morally equivalent to the pain and suffering we see in the actual world. Why? The key point is that there'll be no decisive reason for preferring one with slightly less suffering. And here, PVI lands on a vagueness claim. So if there's vagueness in a claim, then there's no particular one point that you can say on this side is A and on this side is B. No, it's a sliding scale, and it isn't always clear where things land in this scale. So he gives the example of two prison sentences. Sentence 1 gets 10 years, and sentence 2 is 10 years minus a day, right? So technically, sentence 2 is a lighter sentence, but they both have the same impact on deterrence. So even if, here's the concept, even if God could have used a pattern of suffering that contained less suffering of beasts than what we see in this actual world, either way, he could have achieved his overall goal, right? So it's where to draw the line is sort of arbitrary, because God could have achieved his goal with a world of the pattern of suffering we see in the actual world, or slightly less. And he says there's no morally decisive reason to prefer one over the other. So, quote, it may be that God has had to choose some amount of suffering as the amount contained in the actual world, and could have, consistently with his purposes, have chosen any vast array of smaller or greater amounts, right? He had to just kind of land on creating a world with some amount of suffering as the amount contained in the actual world. But there's this sliding scale where there could have been more, there could have been less, and that all members of this vast array of alternative amounts are morally equivalent. Why? Because they all achieve the same goal, right? So there could be this range of more or less suffering that are morally equivalent because there's no decisive reason to favor one over the other, and because they would all achieve God's purposes, at least from God's perspective, right? So the upshot, this is where it applies back to the fawn, even if the fawn's suffering is pointless, right, isn't necessary to achieve a greater good or prevent a worse evil, it doesn't count as evidence against God, because God may just have had to draw a morally arbitrary line through the set of threatened evils, and the fawn's suffering just happened to land on the actuality side of the line. So God allowed for some suffering, God prevented some suffering, or chose not to make a world with some sets of suffering, but he had to choose to create a world that had some amount of suffering, and this is going to be the actual world, so this is going to be the actual suffering, and unfortunately the fawn just fell on the side of actuality, right? So why does this means like that fawn's suffering isn't evidence against God. God just had to choose, and there were many different choices of the suffering of beasts, more or less, that God could have chosen that would have been equivalent to, morally equivalent, in order to achieve his goals. So the big picture is, assuming God has a good reason for permitting the suffering of beasts, he could have prevented specific instances of suffering without thwarting his reason for allowing the suffering of beasts, but he couldn't have prevented all of them and still realize that good reason, and there may well be no minimum number of cases of intense suffering that God could allow without forfeiting whatever good depends on the suffering of beasts, just as there's no shortest sentence that a legislature can establish as the penalty for armed assault without forfeiting the good of effective deterrence. So you might say, well, just go with a little less. Isn't that better? Okay, he could achieve his goal. Now go a little less suffering. He could achieve his goal, his good, a little less. And there may be no minimum that you could actually establish such that God would still achieve his goal. So he had to, it was in a sense arbitrary, the amount he landed on, because he had to land on some consistent with his purposes, and there was no minimum, right? So if he prevented all animals from suffering, he couldn't achieve the good that comes out of animal suffering, assuming God has a good in mind for allowing it. And here's the key. If, quote, therefore, theists can tell a story according which God has a reason for permitting the suffering of beasts, if theists have a defense that can be used successfully to counter the global argument from animal suffering, they need not be embarrassed by the fact that they are unable to see what outweighing good might depend on some particular instance of animal suffering, right? So you say, oh, the fawn's suffering is horrible, but that's just given the global argument, and that God wanted to create a world containing humans, and massive irregularity is at least as bad of a defect as a world containing higher level sentient creatures. And even though that's going to necessarily involve pain and suffering in nature and, in us, then when it comes to looking at particular instances of suffering, we need not be embarrassed. It's unfortunate. That's the way things fell, actually, that fawn would suffer and die. But it wasn't the case that God could have, that there's some minimum that would have excluded that fawn's suffering that God could have chosen in a non-arbitrary way and then still achieved his purposes, right? So, quote, it might be that they cannot see what good might have this feature for the simple reason that no possible good has this feature, right? But as we've seen, a morally perfect God might have allowed this instance of suffering even though no good at all came from it, because at a global level, he had to pick some suffering and he couldn't prevent all suffering and still achieve his goals. And there's no minimum amount he could achieve that would be sufficient, necessarily jointly sufficient for achieving his goals, right? So he just had to pick some. And even though no good came from it, that was just the way things worked out, because ultimately there was the good of producing animals like us, higher level sentient creatures. So I hope that has been helpful. I realize that's kind of a lot, because PVI is a lot. He's a brilliant philosopher, and when you read his stuff, like he's very accessible in terms of the English, but the ideas are complex. So if you have any questions, I'd love to hear your questions. If you have objections, I'd love to hear your objections. What do you think? Do you think PVI's argument works? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Make sure to subscribe and like, and we'll see you in the next video.